Professional laundries in Victorian London cleaned your clothes in human urine. Chimney sweeps sent children small enough to fit inside the flues. And in a house with 11 fireplaces burning through every night of January, the girl who lit every single one of them was not permitted to stand near any of them. She is 14 years old. She earns £6 a year. She has not had a day off in 47 days. And the frost on her window this morning formed on the inside of the glass. Stay until the end to find out why most kitchen maids lost permanent feeling in their fingers before age 20, and what happened to the ones who got too sick to work. This is not the Victorian era of parlors and piano recitals. This is the other Victorian era, the one that made the first one possible. Frost on the inside of a window is not a metaphor. It is condensation from a human being's breath, freezing against glass that has no insulation between it and a January night in London. It means the air in the room is below zero. It means the person sleeping in that room is not sleeping in a house. They are sleeping in a box attached to a house, and the distinction matters enormously because the house itself is warm. You are not in the house. You are above it, under the roof, in a space the architect designed to store people the way the cellar stores coal. The year's 1881. You are 14 years old. You are a kitchen maid. The 1881 census recorded over 1.3 million domestic servants in England and Wales, making it the single largest employment category in the country outside of agriculture. Of those, kitchen maids sat near the bottom of a hierarchy so precisely calibrated that the distance between a kitchen maid and a scullery maid was considered socially meaningful by everyone involved. You ranked above the scullery maid. Below you, the girl who cleaned the pots. Above you, the cook, the housekeeper, the lady's maid, the butler, and the family itself, arranged in ascending order of warmth, comfort, and legal protection, all of which decreased at exactly the rate that yours did. Your room is in the attic. This is not incidental. Attic placement was structural policy. Heating servants' quarters was considered by most household management authorities of the period to be an unnecessary expense, and the logic was never hidden. You were a working body. Working bodies generated their own heat. The family's rooms were insulated, draped, and supplied with coal fires. Yours was not. The gap between those two facts is the story. London in January 1881 recorded overnight temperatures between -3 and -6 degrees Celsius. Inside your unheated attic room, the temperature tracked closely with the outside. The single-pane glass in the small window offered no meaningful insulation. Condensation from your breathing froze against it during the night, producing the frost you see every morning when you open your eyes, a delicate pattern that would be called beautiful if you were the kind of person who got to decide what was beautiful and what was simply the temperature of your life. The wash basin has frozen again. This is not an occasional event. In January, it is the rule. You crack the surface with the handle of your hairbrush, the same way you did yesterday, the same way you will do tomorrow. The water underneath is close to freezing. You wash your face with it anyway because the alternative is appearing before the housekeeper with yesterday's soot still in your hairline, and that is a conversation you cannot afford. Dressing happens in complete darkness. Candles are the housekeeper's property, locked away and distributed by allocation. Your allocation does not cover early mornings. Over the months since you arrived, you have memorized every hook, every tie, every button by touch, your fingers working the fastenings in sequence the way a musician works a scale, not by thinking about it, but by having done it so many times that the body knows before the mind decides. 5 layers minimum. Chemise, corset, 2 petticoats, dress, white apron, mob cap. In summer, this takes 8 minutes. In January, with fingers that barely bend, it takes closer to 20. The boots are the worst part of the morning. They have been sitting on the floor since last night, and they were not dry when you took them off. They are not dry now. Cold leather that has spent 8 hours in an unheated room does not simply feel cold. It feels hostile. You lace them anyway because there is no other option, and because in 10 minutes you will be descending 4 flights of stone stairs in the dark, and stone stairs in January without boots are not a serious alternative. This is the part that the household management manuals of the period never mentioned, not because it was unknown, but because it was assumed. The physical deterioration that began not in the scullery or the coal cellar, but here, in this room, before the working day officially started. Chilblains were so common among kitchen maids that Victorian medical literature treated them less as injuries and more as occupational characteristics, like a blacksmith's calluses or a sailor's rope burns. Red and purple swellings on the fingers, toes, and ears caused by repeated exposure to cold followed by rapid rewarming. They itched. They cracked. They bled. Many kitchen maids developed permanent scarring and reduced sensation in their hands by the end of their second winter, the nerves having absorbed more damage than the tissue could repair between seasons. You are in your first winter. Your hands have not yet reached that point. They will. The bell in the corridor has not yet rung, but it will in 4 minutes, and you already know this because your body has learned the household schedule at a cellular level, the way bodies learn anything that carries sufficient consequence. You pick up your candle stub, what remains of last night's allocation, and open the door. The corridor is colder than the room. There is no logical reason it should be, and yet it always is. The draft from the stairwell pulling what little warmth accumulated overnight straight through the gap at the floor. You pull your apron flat, set your jaw, and start toward the stairs. She hasn't eaten yet. She hasn't spoken to anyone, and she's already behind. The kitchen range was the most important object in the Victorian household, and the most important thing you need to understand about it is that it was not yours. It was cast iron, 5 to 6 feet wide, and weighed somewhere between 400 and 600 pounds, depending on the model. It burned coal continuously. It heated water, powered cooking, and regulated the temperature of the kitchen, which was the thermal engine of the entire house. Every hot meal, every warm bath, every pot of tea that appeared effortlessly in the drawing room at 4 in the afternoon traced its origin back to this machine. And every morning, without exception, it was your job to resurrect it from the previous night's embers before anyone else in the house opened their eyes. The deadline was 5:30 a.m. Not approximate, not flexible. The cook arrived at 6 a.m. to begin breakfast preparation, and she arrived expecting heat. If the range was cold when she walked in, the investigation into why lasted approximately 30 seconds and concluded with the same answer every time. You. The cause was always you, regardless of whether the embers from the night before had been viable, regardless of whether the coal was damp, regardless of whether the kindling had been stored somewhere, it absorbed moisture from the stone floor. The Book of Household Management, the period's most widely consulted domestic authority, was explicit on this point. Failure to light the range was grounds for immediate dismissal without reference. Without a reference, you could not obtain another position in domestic service. The system enforced its own compliance through consequences too severe to test. The process began with the ash. Yesterday's coal left behind a deep bed of gray residue that had to be raked out before new fuel could catch. You knelt on flagstone floors to do this. In January, before the range was lit, the average temperature in a Victorian kitchen was between 4 and 6 degrees Celsius, and flagstone conducts cold the way metal conducts electricity, pulling heat out of your knees and shins with a thoroughness that felt less like temperature and more like intention. You knelt there for 20 to 30 minutes, face close to the grate, breathing ash and residual smoke while you laid paper, then kindling. Then arrange the first coal carefully enough to allow air circulation but densely enough to sustain combustion once it caught. Matches were not always available. They were the housekeeper's property, distributed sparingly and not guaranteed at 4:45 in the morning. What you had instead was last night's surviving heat, buried under the ash if you had banked the range correctly the previous evening. A faint orange core that you coaxed with breath and patience into something capable of igniting paper. This required proximity. Your face 6 inches from the grate, coal dust in your eyelashes, smoke curling into your throat before the flue opened properly and the draft pulled it upward. The chronic cough that Victorian medical literature documented as nearly universal among kitchen maids did not originate in the scullery or the cellar. It began here every morning in the first 30 minutes of the working day, before the household had stirred and before anyone upstairs had registered that they were cold. By 6 a.m. the range was lit. The kitchen temperature was beginning to climb. And then the cook arrived, took her position at the range, and the social geography of warmth asserted itself with the quiet efficiency of a system that had never needed to announce its own rules. The cook worked the center. You worked the periphery, scullery, cellar, yard, the cold zones. The fire you had built from nothing, that you had coaxed from last night's embers with your face in the ash at 4:45 in the morning, now belonged to the preparation of a breakfast you would not eat until its leftovers were cold. This was not incidental to the Victorian domestic system. It was structural. Kitchen maids ranked second from the bottom of the household hierarchy, and that ranking was expressed spatially and thermally as much as financially. The warmth moved upward through the house in precise correspondence with social position. Family rooms received the most coal, the most consistent fires, the most attention. Upper servants received moderate heat. Kitchen maids received the heat generated by their own labor, which is to say they received whatever leaked from a machine they were not permitted to stand beside once the person above them in the hierarchy had arrived to claim it. She built the fire. She was not allowed near the fire. These two facts existed simultaneously, without contradiction, for every morning of every winter of her working life, which at 14 years old had barely started. By 6 a.m. the range was lit. The kitchen was beginning to warm. She would not stand near it again for the rest of the morning. The yard pump froze. This was not a crisis. This was Tuesday. Cast iron yard pumps in Victorian London froze regularly during January nights, the water inside the mechanism expanding against the metal until the handle locked solid and nothing moved regardless of how hard you pulled. The solution was not complicated. You carried a boiling kettle from the range out into the yard and poured it over the pump mechanism until the ice inside surrendered and the handle moved again. This added approximately 15 minutes to the start of a task that had not yet officially begun. Nobody recorded those 15 minutes. Nobody compensated for them. They were simply the opening cost of a morning that had not finished presenting its invoice. 6 to 8 buckets of water were required before breakfast alone. Each bucket held approximately 10 to 12 liters. You carried them by hand across the yard and into the kitchen, a distance that varied by household but never varied in temperature, which was the same as the air, which in January 1881 London was somewhere between -3 and -6 degrees Celsius. The cast iron handle of the bucket conducted that temperature directly into your palm with no mediation. By the third bucket, your wrists had gone numb. By the sixth, your hands had lost reliable grip, and you were carrying the load through a combination of muscle memory and the fact that dropping it was not an acceptable outcome. This was before 7 a.m. The scullery work had not yet started. The scullery was where the family's dishes were washed, and the family's dishes were not ordinary objects. Fine china, gilt-edged, imported, expensive and fragile, in the way that only objects owned by people who never wash their own dishes can afford to be. A chip was not an accident. A chip was a conversation with the housekeeper, and that conversation did not go well for the person holding the broken piece. You washed them with the full understanding that your hands were the last line of defense between a piece of porcelain and a consequence that would follow you into your employment record. There was no running hot water in the scullery. Water was heated on the range, carried by hand to the basin, and cooled at a rate that the January air accelerated with genuine enthusiasm. The washing cycle followed a predictable and punishing arc. Hot at the start, lukewarm in the middle, cold by the end. Your hands transitioned through the full spectrum in a single session, moving from the mild shock of water hot enough to sting into progressively colder temperatures as the task continued and the basin gave up its heat to the stone walls and the flagstone floor, and the air that moved through the scullery with the quiet persistence of something that had nowhere else to be. The soap was lye-based, alkaline, corrosive, and standard in Victorian kitchens because it cut grease efficiently and cost almost nothing. It also opened cracked skin with similar efficiency. The combination of cold water, repeated wetting and drying, and prolonged lye exposure produced a specific pattern of damage that Victorian medical surveys documented with enough consistency to constitute a professional signature. Cracked knuckles, split fingertips, skin at the base of the fingers that broke open at the joints and did not fully heal between sessions because the sessions came every day, and the healing time available was the few hours between the last wash and the first one tomorrow. The documented remedy was goose fat or kitchen dripping rubbed into the hands at night. It softened the tissue enough to reduce the depth of the cracking and provided a minimal barrier against the following morning's assault. Many kitchen maids applied it by feel in the dark after lights out, the smell distinctive enough that they learned to wash it off thoroughly before appearing in the main house. An unusual smell on a kitchen maid was a failure of invisible presentation, which was the only kind of presentation that mattered. The 1884 report produced by the Women's Trade Union League identified hand injuries from cold water exposure as among the most commonly cited physical conditions in domestic servants. The report was earnest, thorough, and largely ignored by the households it described. Many kitchen maids had permanently cracked, scarred knuckles by age 16. The damage was considered occupational rather than medical, which meant it was considered normal, which meant it was considered acceptable, which meant nobody was required to do anything about it. By the time the breakfast dishes were finished, you had carried roughly 80 liters of water. Your hands had been in and out of progressively cold water for the better part of an hour. The lye soap had done its work, and the morning was not close to finished. The water was only the beginning. What came next left marks that never fully healed. The coal cellar was below ground, and below ground in a Victorian townhouse in January meant something specific. It meant a temperature that hovered consistently between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius, regardless of the season, lower during hard frost, never warm, never anything approaching comfortable. It meant walls that sweated with condensation, and stairs that were narrow and steep and coated in a fine layer of coal dust that became a reliable skating surface the moment any moisture touched it. It meant darkness except for the single tallow candle you carried, whose light was barely sufficient to show you where the next step was, and entirely insufficient to show you whether that step was dry. You made this trip alone, 3 times a day at minimum, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, depending on the weather and the number of fireplaces burning, and the rate at which the family upstairs decided the rooms felt insufficiently warm. Nobody accompanied you. Nobody timed you. Nobody noted in any household record that you had descended and ascended the equivalent of a small building's worth of stairs multiple times before noon, carrying loads that a modern occupational health assessment would flag immediately. A standard Victorian coal scuttle, when filled to working capacity, weighed between 15 and 18 kilograms. For reference, current workplace manual handling guidelines recommend a maximum single lift of around 25 kilograms for a healthy adult under ideal conditions. You were 14 years old. You had been awake since 4:30 a.m., your hands were already damaged from the morning's waterwork, and the stairs you were climbing were slick with coal dust in an unlit basement. The conditions were not ideal. The guidelines did not exist. The coal still needed to reach the fireplaces. The legal framework governing your situation was straightforward in what it offered you, which was almost nothing. The Truck Acts of 1831 nominally protected workers from certain forms of wage manipulation. Domestic servants were explicitly excluded from their provisions. This was not an oversight. It was a classification decision, a determination that the work performed inside a private household existed in a legal category distinct from labor performed in a factory or a trade, and that the protections developed for the latter did not extend to the former. You had no contract that specified working hours. You had no sick pay. You had no recourse if dismissed for injury. You had a reference if the housekeeper chose to provide one. And the housekeeper's decision on that point was governed entirely by her own judgment and the household's interests, which were not the same as yours. The injury reality was documented not in employment records, which barely acknowledged your existence, but in hospital admission ledgers, which occasionally noted the circumstances of working women brought in for treatment. Falls on coal cellar stairs appeared in those records with enough regularity to establish pattern. A maid who broke a limb faced a specific cascade of consequences. She could not perform her duties. A maid who could not perform her duties was not useful. A maid who was not useful was dismissed, typically without the full reference she would need to find alternative employment, because a reference was a reward for satisfactory service, and an injury that interrupted service was not satisfactory by definition. The logic was circular, and the outcome was consistent. Now consider what you were carrying and where it was going. The coal in your scuttle would be distributed across the household's fireplaces, according to a hierarchy that expressed itself in BTS as clearly as it did in wages. The drawing room fire burned for the family's comfort during the evening, The dining room fire burned for the family's appetite at mealtimes. The master's study fire burned for the family's concentration. The mistress's bedroom fire burned so that she would not feel the season when she woke. These fires demanded constant fuel because a fire allowed to drop in a room the family occupied was a visible failure of household management. And visible failures had consequences that traced back down the hierarchy to their origin point, which was you. Your room had no fire. It had not had a fire all winter. Heating servants' quarters was, as Victorian household management literature consistently noted, an unnecessary expense. The family's comfort was the purpose of the household. Your comfort was not a household concern. You generated warmth for 11 rooms and lived in the one space in the building where warmth was explicitly withheld. The coal dust settled into your hair, your apron, the creases of your knuckles. By the second trip, it was in your eyelashes. By the third, it was in your lungs, contributing to the slow accumulation that would produce the chronic cough Victorian medical literature documented as characteristic of the position. 3 trips to the cellar, 4, sometimes 5. And upstairs, the family had not noticed the cold at all. Somewhere above your head, separated from you by several inches of floorboard and an unbridgeable distance of social class, the family was waking up. Not to cold. That is the first and most important thing to understand about the family's mourning. They did not wake to cold because cold was your problem to solve before they opened their eyes. The fires in the family bedrooms had been lit while they slept. Hot water had been carried to their washstands, poured into porcelain basins that held heat far better than the cracked clay jug in your attic room. The lady of the house wore a fur-trimmed morning robe indoors, a garment whose primary purpose was comfort in a house that was already warm, the equivalent of carrying an umbrella inside a building with a roof. The temperature difference between her morning and yours was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of design. A middle-class London household in 1881 burned coal in 3 to 5 fireplaces continuously through the winter months. The fuel cost was significant, managed carefully by the housekeeper, and distributed according to a logic that placed family rooms first, upper servant rooms second, and kitchen staff rooms not at all. The family did not manage this distribution themselves. They did not think about coal in any practical sense. Coal appeared in fireplaces. Fireplaces produced warmth. The mechanism connecting those two facts was invisible by intention, because a well-run Victorian household was one in which the labor sustaining it left no visible trace. This invisibility was not accidental, and it was not informal. Victorian domestic service guides of the period explicitly instructed kitchen maids on the protocol for moving through the main house. You did not use the family's staircases except when your duties required it. You did not linger in rooms you had entered to clean or tend. You did not make eye contact unless spoken to. If a family member appeared unexpectedly in a corridor you occupied, you stepped to the wall and looked downward until they passed. A kitchen maid observed by the family in the main rooms of the house, in circumstances that were not strictly task-related, had committed a social error, and social errors in domestic service were professional errors, with professional consequences. The system required you to be present everywhere and visible nowhere, which is a remarkable thing to demand of a human being and an entirely ordinary thing to demand of a piece of household equipment, which is the category the system placed you in. The family knew the cook by name. The cook was a skilled professional whose departure would require effort to replace, and whose meals were a daily demonstration of competence that the family directly experienced. The housekeeper was known by name. The butler was known by name. The lady's maid was known by name because she worked in physical proximity to the mistress, and that proximity required acknowledgement. You were not known by name. You were below the threshold of individual recognition. Victorian household management guides of the period describe the ideal kitchen maid in terms of qualities, diligence, cleanliness, willingness, reliability, and never in terms of personhood. You were a function. Functions do not require names. You knew their names. You knew all of them. You knew the master's name, and the mistress's name, and the names of both children, and the name of the dog, and the name of the cousin who visited in November and stayed 3 weeks longer than anyone had planned for, and whose extended presence created additional washing up that nobody upstairs considered and everybody downstairs absorbed. You knew these things because knowing them was operationally necessary. Your work required precise awareness of the household's composition, schedule, and preferences. Their comfort depended on your detailed knowledge of their lives. Your existence did not register in their awareness at all. Your wages place this asymmetry in its starkest form. £6 per year at the lower end, perhaps 10 at the upper end for a more experienced girl. The purchasing power of £6 in 1881 was roughly equivalent to one decent winter coat annually, assuming you bought nothing else. Most kitchen maids in this period sent a portion of their wages home to family in rural counties, Norfolk, Suffolk, Somerset, places where agricultural work had contracted, and a daughter in domestic service represented a meaningful contribution to household survival. You had not seen your mother in 11 months. The £6 that connected you to her arrived by post in increments, each one representing weeks of the work described in the previous sections of this account. The family upstairs had a warm morning, a hot breakfast, and no awareness of the cost at which those things arrived. She knew the name of every member of that family, every dog, every visiting cousin. Not one of them knew her name. This is what the beautiful Victorian house actually ran on. The cough started as a tickle. By the second week of January, it had settled into something lower and more permanent, a heaviness in the chest that arrived each morning with the coal dust and stayed through the washing up and the cellar trips and the final hours of the evening, a constant companion that you learned to manage rather than treat, because treating it required resources you did not have and time the household had no interest in providing. Getting sick in domestic service in 1881 was not a medical problem. It was a professional crisis. The distinction matters because it shaped everything about how illness was experienced, concealed, and ultimately resolved. And the resolution was rarely in your favor. There was no sick leave. The concept did not exist in the legal vocabulary governing domestic service. There was no minimum wage, no union, no contract specifying your rights in the event of incapacity. The Truck Acts that nominally protected other categories of workers had explicitly excluded you. What you had was a position, and the position was contingent on your ability to perform it, and your ability to perform it was contingent on your body, and your body was spending January in conditions specifically designed to compromise it. The masking behaviors documented in Victorian servant diaries and social reform accounts of the period were not vanity. They were survival calculations performed under significant pressure. Rubbing your cheeks with coarse wool before appearing in the main house produced a flush that read as health rather than exhaustion. Suppressing a cough in the presence of the housekeeper or family required the kind of muscular control that itself cost energy, which was precisely the resource already running short. You pressed your lips together. You held your breath through the spasm. You waited until you were in the coal cellar or the yard, somewhere sufficiently removed from observation, before allowing your chest to do what it needed to do. The housekeeper watched. This is important to understand about the housekeeper's role. She was not cruel in any theatrical sense. She was managerial, which in this context produced outcomes indistinguishable from cruelty. Her responsibility was the smooth operation of the household, and a sick kitchen maid was a disruption to smooth operation. A kitchen maid who displayed visible symptoms was a kitchen maid whose continued employment required a calculation, and the calculation was not complicated. Could the work be done? If yes, it would be done. If no, the position would be filled by someone whose body had not yet reached its current state of deterioration. The workhouse loomed behind every cough you suppressed. This is not rhetorical. The Victorian workhouse of 1881. London was a documented institution deliberately designed to be worse than the worst independent poverty. The theory being that conditions sufficiently unpleasant would discourage dependency and encourage self-sufficiency. Families were separated upon entry. Hard and often deliberately pointless labor was required in exchange for food and shelter. The stigma of workhouse admission followed a person into subsequent attempts at employment. A kitchen maid without a reference, dismissed for inability to work, had a narrow range of options below domestic service, and the workhouse sat at the bottom of that range, not as a last resort, but as a real destination that real people reached. Medical care was not accessible to you on £6 per year. A doctor's visit cost more than you could set aside from a month's wages after sending money home. What existed instead was a folk pharmacopoeia maintained in the servants' quarters and administered in the margins of the working day. Mustard poultices applied to the chest after the housekeeper retired. Ginger steeped in hot water from the range, drunk quickly in the kitchen before anyone arrived to object. Onion pouches sewn into small fabric packets and worn under the dress. A remedy documented in multiple servant accounts and based on no medical principle that would survive modern scrutiny, but costing nothing and providing the psychological comfort of doing something, which was not nothing when the alternative was doing nothing. The senior cook might offer warm broth if she judged the situation serious enough. This was considered generosity. It was not an obligation. No document of the period framed it as a right. When the housekeeper finally made the determination that a kitchen maid was too ill to continue, the process was brief. You were summoned. The contract was terminated. Wages were paid for days worked, with deductions for any breakages recorded against your name. You were given an hour to vacate your room. You left through the back door before the family came down for breakfast, because a dismissed servant visible to the family was an untidiness that well-managed households did not permit. She worked through it. She always worked through it, because she had seen what happened to those who didn't. The family finished dinner at approximately 9 in the evening, and the plates came down. This was the heaviest washing up of the day, the full weight of a formal Victorian dinner service descending into the scullery at the moment when your body had already absorbed 17 hours of January. Fine china, silver cutlery, crystal glasses, serving dishes that had held multiple courses for multiple people, all of it requiring the same careful attention demanded by the morning's breakfast service, the same cold water progression, the same lye soap, The same hands that had been performing variations of this task since before 6 a.m. The apron you had put on clean that morning was soaked through. Your boots had not been dry since the second-yard pump run. The cracked skin on your knuckles had opened and opened again enough times through the day that the distinction between a fresh crack and a healing one had become academic. You were alone in the kitchen. The cook had gone to bed. This was standard. The cook's working day ended with the family's dinner. Yours ended with the consequences of it. No one checked whether you had eaten. The household management guides of the period specified the servants' meal arrangements with considerable precision regarding the family's table, the upper servants' table, and the kitchen staff's entitlement to whatever remained after those two prior claims had been satisfied. In practice, what remained after a formal dinner service, by the time the washing up was finished, was cold, reduced, and occasionally nothing. The guides did not address this scenario because the guides were written by and for the people whose meals were guaranteed, and the problem of whether the kitchen maid had eaten was not a problem that registered in that literature. Before you could go to bed, the range required banking. This was a technical task with consequences attached to both possible errors. Too much coal laid on the fire before you closed it down for the night, and it would burn through by 3 a.m., leaving cold embers by 4:30 a.m., when you needed viable heat to restart the morning fire. Too little, and the range would not survive until morning at all. Either outcome produced the same conversation with the housekeeper, and that conversation always concluded with the same determination of fault. The correct amount was something you learned through repetition and error, calibrating by instinct and experience, adjusting for the quality of the coal and the temperature of the night and the draft in the flue, becoming over time a kind of specialist in a skill that appeared in no job description and earned no additional recognition. You banked the range. You swept the kitchen floor. You wiped the surfaces. You checked that everything was in the state the cook expected to find it at 6 a.m., because the cook's morning efficiency depended on your evening thoroughness, and any disruption to that sequence had a known direction of blame. Then you picked up your candle, 1 candle per night. That was your allocation. The candle that had guided you through the morning's dark corridors was the same candle that would take you up 4 flights of stairs at 9:30 p.m. and illuminate the 20 minutes of undressing that stood between you and the end of the day. You managed the flame carefully, cupping your hand against drafts that would end it prematurely, because a candle extinguished in a dark stairwell at 9:30 p.m. was not a minor inconvenience. It was a navigational problem on stairs that had already demonstrated their capacity for causing injury. The hooks on your dress worked in reverse now, your cold fingers finding them by the same muscle memory that had fastened them in the morning dark. The wash basin had frozen again in the hours since morning. You had carried and heated and poured enough water through the day to supply a household, and now the inch of water left in your own basin had returned to ice while you were downstairs sustaining everyone else's warmth. You washed your face with what you could break loose from the surface, and it was the same temperature it had been 17 hours earlier when the day began. You had lit the range from cold embers. You had hauled approximately 80 liters of water. You had made 4 to 5 coal cellar trips carrying a combined load of 60 to 90 kilograms across the course of the day. You had washed dishes across 3 meal services. You had swept ash from multiple fireplaces. You had done all of this on whatever remained of yesterday's food, in clothes that were never fully dry, with hands that bore the cumulative damage of every previous winter day stacked on top of today's. Average Victorian kitchen maid. 1/2 day off per fortnight. There was no day off this week. She lay in the dark, and somewhere below, the range she had built that morning was still burning for a house that would never notice if she wasn't. The frost on the inside of the attic window is still there. It is 9:30 p.m. She has been awake for 17 hours. At 4:30 a.m. she will wake again, crack the basin ice with her hairbrush handle, dress in the dark by memory, and descend 4 flights of stone stairs to kneel on a cold flagstone floor and coax fire from last night's embers. She left no diary. What we know comes from household accounts, census records, medical surveys, and the occasional employer's ledger. She was one of over 1.3 million. Most of them have no names in the historical record at all. The house still stands. The family's name is on a plaque outside. Hers is not recorded anywhere. The Victorians built an era on the premise that certain kinds of suffering, if kept quiet enough, didn't really count. She kept it quiet. It counted. If this story deserves to be told, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.